I was so recently moved by the story, and I felt like there was a lot of, material to go and kind of visualize. So I was really interested in it, and the podcast was so compelling that it had me asking all the right questions, afterwards, and I was kind of becoming my own internet sleuth. So the timing was perfect.
And Rabia, you've been asking questions on Adnan's behalf, on behalf of his family, for a number of years now. It's interesting that you say everyone else has given up on Adnan Syed, but you haven't. What drives you in this?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that necessarily. I mean, I think after he was convicted, much of the community gave up because they just didn't know. They didn't understand the system and how to fight it. But I was in law school at the time, and I knew that there were still hope as long as there's ways to go forward and appeal. I also believed he was innocent. I had sat through parts of the trial that the rest of the community had not, and I saw that there was no case against him. I saw how terrible the evidence was and how thin the case was. And so for me, I have always been convinced of his innocence. I've been convinced that this has been a travesty of justice. And so I just kept pushing, and thanks to Serial, we now have an incredibly robust team of lawyers and investigators and other folks, like coming together to really dig the truth out of here.
The documentary opens itself up to the criticism that Serial had, to an extent, that this is all very much told from Adnan and his family's point of view, and people will say that that is biased. What's your defence of what you've made?
Well, I just started with the state's case. I mean, I don't know if you can call it bias. I looked at exactly what was presented in the trial, and I kind of pulled it apart. And there was just, it was very flimsy, as Rabia said. There were just things that you would want to corroborate statements. Whenever there's just an eyewitness who is the kind of evidence against a person, it makes you pause, because there's just nothing kind of tangible. There was DNA, there were fingerprints, there were a lot of things that could have corroborated the story that was presented, and it just wasn't. So I was interested in trying to find out why, culturally and logistically.
And Rabia, it's important to remember that there were 2 young lives destroyed in this, 2 families completely torn apart. How is Hae represented in this documentary? How is she remembered and represented?
I mean, Amy's done a tremendous job in bringing Hae to life in a way that, and I'm somebody who, I've read her diary many times. It's a piece of evidence, and so we look to that diary to understand, to see like what was really happening in her life. But even for me, the first time I saw how Hae was, like, her diary was animated, it was incredibly beautiful and touching and moving. So I think anybody who sees this series, the absence of her voice through Serial and all the other investigations that have happened in the last few years, that you're not going to feel that this time. You're going to see, you're not only going to feel her presence, you're also going to feel the presence of 17-year-old Adnan too, because he's also brought to life in a way that we haven't seen before.
We hear him in the documentary speaking. How is he? Obviously, Serial blew up all over the world. His story is world famous. Now you have this documentary giving him renewed hope of getting back into the legal system and getting his case reheard. How's he doing?
He's doing well. I mean, look, the last 5 years, what has buoyed his spirits is that fact that we're getting closer and closer to the truth, right? All he's been able to say is, I'm innocent, I don't know what happened here. And he had to rely on people outside of the prison to try to prove what actually happened to Hae Min Lee. And so we're getting closer to the truth, and that, I'm sure, that's something he's always wanted. He just wants the truth out there. We got a terrible decision from the court 2 weeks ago, and that they reinstated his verdict, and he's not getting a new trial now, which is what we expected to happen this year. So that's been a setback, and we understand it's going to take a longer fight in court. But this documentary also is bringing us evidence that will help us in that fight.
Something that people found problematic when they found out about the case of Adnan Syed is that he was sentenced to life in prison, largely based on the testimony of one witness, a high school friend called Jay. The big question is, we didn't hear from him in the podcast Serial. Do we hear from him in your documentary?
I spoke to Jay. He's not on camera in the film. I spoke to him extensively, and I spoke to the people that supported his statement, as well as the person he had a child with, and I painted a picture. We have a lot of, you won't feel the absence of him because we have a lot of, the tapes with the detectives, and I feel like, we really created a full portrait of Jay. Jay is also a victim of the system, in my opinion. I mean, he helped the police and unfortunately hasn't been able to remember his story every time he repeats it. It's a different story. So there are problems with his testimony, and I explore that.
Do you think we'll ever find out the truth, Rabia?
I actually do. I think it could take a lot longer, but I feel like we haven't come this far without having some
Right.
resolution. Like, we've come so far that I really, really feel like one day the absolute complete truth about what happened to Hae Min Lee will come out.